welcome to the Empowering Women podcast. I am so thrilled to release this episode on a day that is near and dear to my heart, International Women's Day. But today, I am so giddy to share with you two amazing women who have been incredibly important to my personal journey, Morgan Cox and Diane Diaz. Carol is the founder and CEO of Speaking Your Brand, a coaching and training company that helps high-performing, purpose-driven women, entrepreneurs, and professionals create their signature talks and thought leadership platforms. Diane is a lead speaking coach and personal brand strategist with Speaking Your Brand. She has coached dozens of speakers in crafting their signature talks, TED-style talks, and virtual presentations, including yours truly. So I could not ask for two better guests to teach us how to uplift our own voices and, just as important, those of other women. Welcome, Carol and Diane, to the podcast.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Absolutely. And for those who may watch the video, we're actually recording this on Valentine's Day. So I'm sporting my heart sweater. Diane's got on her red. So we are ready for Galentine's Day. So we're having Galentine's hour sort of on International Women's Day. We're doing a 2-for-1 on that one. So as our listeners know, we typically start our conversations by learning more about our guest's story. You both are amazing storytellers. I've had the chance to see that up close and personal. And Diane is a comedian. So that's her newfound fame. So this is going to be so much fun. So Carol, I'm going to start with you. Tell us more about your journey that brought you to this point.
Well, it was definitely a winding road, everything from history to local politics to technology to now what I do with Speaking Your Brand. And since I know a lot of your audience are involved in STEM, I'll kind of focus on the tech background part. So I founded 2 different software development companies, worked with Fortune 500 companies to small businesses to political candidates over the years. So I really enjoyed the software development, but then I got to the point where I was kind of burnt out from the coding and wanted to work more with people. But during that tech career that I had, I would do a lot of public speaking, everything from tech demos to conferences around marketing and business and technology. And usually I was one of the very few women who were at those events, definitely on stage. And I kind of noticed it, but kind of didn't at the same time. So then when I was thinking about what was the next business I wanted to start, I knew that helping women get on more stages to have that voice and visibility, whether it's in STEM or tech or any industry, is so important because we need women's voices and stories out there.
Yes, we do. Do you mind telling a little story about when you lost your voice? I think it's so powerful. Do you mind telling that part of the story?
Oh, not at all. So this was when I was involved in local politics. I became chairperson of the Democratic Party in the county where I lived. I was 30 years old, so bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and very eager to make a difference and recruit candidates, including women candidates, to run for office and encourage voters to come out to vote. So I did. We also did a big media campaign. So I went on the TV news a lot and was invited on. And so the group of supporters who championed me to become chairperson, all of a sudden, about a year or so into my tenure, didn't like that I was getting as much attention as I was, even though I was doing it entirely on behalf of the party and the candidates. But they didn't like it, an ambitious woman with a very public presence and a public voice. So they turned on me and decided to bully me instead of support me. And it was a really low point in my professional and personal life because I didn't have any other support system other than them. That was my support circle. And so I decided not to run for re-election as chair, decided not to run for Congress, as had been talked about by political leaders, and really basically just kind of slunk away. I really, no one from the outside would know anything was wrong with me, but I know I lost my voice and my confidence and kind of my sense of my place in the world for many years after that. And I realized that I actually started Speaking Your Brand to provide that support system for women that I didn't have, but I didn't realize that until about 5 years after I started the business. Like, oh, duh, this is why I structured it the way that I did.
Yeah. Well, thank you for vulnerably sharing that story. I wanted my audience to hear that story because I think we all have that moment where we lose our voice or we can't find our voice. Maybe we just haven't found it yet. So I think it's important for people like yourself, Carol and Diane, who have visible profiles, that just doesn't happen to it happens to everybody likely at some point in their career. Yep. All right, Diane, your turn. What is your story you'd like to share with us today?
Yes, well, it's also very twisty and turny. Nothing is a straight line in your career, is it? I mean, that's how it goes. And I worked in various areas of marketing. I have a degree in marketing and then an MBA. And so I worked in various areas of marketing for a few years. And then once I got my MBA, I started working in marketing for a national land developer. So very male dominated industry, which just, is what I ended up doing. I loved it, but I learned a lot, but it was a hard job in that it was a very corporate space, right? And so all the things that come with that, again, learned a lot, great job, great people, very corporate-y, and a lot of the things about corporate that don't necessarily support work-life balance or women, right? In a very male-dominated industry. And so I think in that way, I never really felt like I had a voice. I was just kind of doing my job and learning all that I could. And then because it was in land development, connected to real estate, obviously, at the end of 2008, they closed down. I lost my job along with thousands of my friends, of course, because that was what happened during that time. And then I started, and this is where I met Carol. I started teaching at a university here in Orlando, and she and I started on the same day. And so when I started teaching, I feel like that was the beginning of me finding my voice, because it was an opportunity to take what I had already learned, which was branding and marketing, and then teach others and get to see them be inspired and learn how they could use it to grow their business, work, in their work or whatever they were doing. And so after a little bit of time, when I kind of decompressed from that corporate experience and sort of, worked through the burnout that I had experienced, and I laid low for a very long time. And then Carol had started Speaking Your Brand. And then I think a couple of years after she started Speaking Your Brand, I started a consulting business, just working with women to help them define their personal brand, create their LinkedIn profiles, optimize their LinkedIn profiles. And in doing that, I was doing speaking, but I hired Carol to help me with my talk.
Oh.
Loved it so much, because Carol and I have known each other for 15 years. So I, of course, knew her, from day one at the university where we teach. So I knew the work she was doing and kind of understood it. And then when I gave that talk that she had helped me with, and it really felt so much better and so much more effective. And I liked the talk more, and I enjoyed giving it more, and I enjoy using my voice more in that way. And so then she asked me to come work for Speaking Your Brand and close my business, which I said, done and done, no problem. So
I'm right there with you, right?
Yeah, I was like, I'm all in. But it was through that, figuring out what power that framework gave to my voice, that I really feel like I kind of stepped into that role of using my voice. And then, of course, now working with other women to help them do the same thing. And I think I just like the also kind of the teaching element of it, because I get to see the clients of ours be able to feel empowered when they get on stage, or take an idea that they had and start speaking to people about it and see the change that makes. And so that kind of inspires me.
Yeah, and then we tend to pass the gift on. I just did some informal coaching on Monday. I hadn't shared that with you guys about some things I learned. So a mentee of mine is doing her first speaking engagement on International Women's Day. So I wish her luck today as she does that.
That's so exciting.
It is really exciting.
Yeah.
So speaking of stories, in honor of International Women's Day, I really want to talk about how women can step forward and share their voices. So they create the positive change that they're looking to create in the world. And so, Diane, I'm going to start with you, and then we'll go to Carol. What do you think are the primary reasons why women won't take the stage and use their voice?
That's a really good question. And I think there's a couple of things happening. One thing is probably lack of confidence. And I don't think it's lack of confidence in that's inflicted on themselves. I think it's a lot of societal pressures that help to kind of instill that lack of confidence, and just tell us, there's so many messages that are telling us we're not enough, or we're not thin enough, tall enough, short enough, whatever enough, young enough, whatever. And so over time, that's going to have an impact on your confidence. And then I feel like that then leads to, well, somebody's already talking about what I want to talk about, right? So then, okay, so I can't talk about that because so-and-so is already doing it. So why would I go share a message like that? And then maybe not even understanding where or how to get started. And to some degree, and I kind of did this, is waiting for someone else to give us permission to use our voice. We don't have to do that. We can just go do it, right? But I think again, that's sort of like that societal pressure and the constructs that maybe many women are in, which is corporate spaces or very sort of constrained spaces that we're looking or waiting for that permission. So I think some of it is coming from within and some of it is coming from outside that we then internalize, and then it keeps us from wanting to speak up.
Carol, anything to add to that?
Yeah. So along with what Diane said, I also feel like for a lot of women and for men too, like we hear these messages that people would rather die than get on a stage and speak before an audience, right? So like we are reinforced all these negative things about public speaking. I think that stems from school, K through 12 schooling, when as a kid, you have to get up and do a presentation in front of your peers. And you know how kids are. And maybe you got embarrassed, or maybe you were really nervous one time. So you have this bad experience and you kind of carry that forward. So I think that's part of it. Like we don't ever grow out of that. But then the other thing is that it feels really physiologically vulnerable to stand in front of a group of people and speak to them, whether you're on a big stage at a conference or even just standing in front of 20 people. I recently attended a fundraiser for women who are running for office in the Central Florida area where Diane and I live. And it's, number one, it is so inspiring to see women stepping up and running for office from school board to county commission to state house to Congress. We need more women running for office. So we did like a speed dating thing where there would be groups of 20 of us in like different parts. And then the candidates would come around and deliver their 2-minute elevator speech to us and then get feedback from us. So it's a very warm, friendly audience. Right. And there's some of them did great, but so many of them apologize, say, oh, I didn't really have a chance to work on my stump speech. I just filed my papers today, or I'm not really ready yet. And so if they feel vulnerable, they feel like that almost like that sense of embarrassment before it even happens. And a lot of the feedback we gave them, like, never apologize if you don't feel prepared. Just do your speech. Like, your story, why you're running. Tell us that from the heart and don't get so caught up in, I need to do these technical things.
Oh my gosh, that's so true. So Diane, what really resonated with me is I still question if my message is important, and there's other people out there with similar messages, and why would anybody care what I have to say? That still runs through my head. And Carol, the first time I stepped on the stage, it was at a Hydraulic Institute conference, so more of a technical conference. I stood there and I thought, golly, I feel like I'm standing up here with no clothes on. Like you just, like you feel like you've opened your heart, you've opened everything, often before you even say 2 words. So I totally get that. You feel very vulnerable on stage. All those people are staring at you. And what I've tried to reframe for myself is they want me to succeed, because they're sitting in there and they want to hear a message, whether they like me, know me, don't, it doesn't matter. They want to receive something.
Yes, absolutely. And, we always say this, the more you do it, the easier it gets. I promise. The first few times you do it, yeah, it feels awkward. It feels uncomfortable. You're going to get nervous because you're not used to it. Do it 10, 20, 30 times. Heck, host a podcast like we do, and you're going to get much better at speaking.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, is that so true? I've told this story so many times, but when Charlie sent me the note to host the podcast, I really thought she was having like an early happy hour or something in Alabama, because I was like, you're crazy. I've never even thought about doing this. But you're right. The more you do it, I'm much better now than I was at the beginning of my first season. So to your point, it gets better with practice. So I have been truly honored, Carol and Diane, to be part of the Speaking Your Brand community. And I've been part of the community for quite a number of years now. The funny part is I'm going to meet them in live for the first time in a couple of weeks. So I'm super excited about that. But I really early on fell in love with your mission of amplifying and championing diverse, progressive, and purpose-driven women's voices. That really strikes at my heart. So talk a little bit about, Carol, you alluded to this, but how does Speaking Your Brand come about? And like, how did you figure out that mission?
Yeah. So as I was thinking about what business I wanted to do next after kind of closing down the technology business. And I really wanted to, again, work with people. And I really wanted to work with women because I had gotten to know a lot of women leaders and public speakers. So I really, and no understanding how important public speaking is to getting our messages out. So I decided to do that. But I can look back to all of my interest and my love of history. I have a graduate degree in history. I was gonna be professor of history, women's history. That was my goal. It's because I was always looking for the women in the stories. And when we traditionally studied history, and back in our generation X, we have a Women's History Month. Why? We have African American History Month. Why? Because history was basically about white men, and then we happened to just like slot in here and there the other people, like the other half of the population, just like slot them into a special month. And so I was always looking for the women because I wanted to know, how did they experience life? Like, I wanted to learn from them. So then getting involved in tech and then politics, and again, most industries are male dominated, including them, seeing that there weren't that many women who, number one, were involved, but in leadership positions. And so knowing that having a public voice and being able to articulate and communicate your message to your audiences is the way to establish leadership and to get to those higher leadership positions, whether it's in a company or in your community or in public office.
Yeah, it's true. So public speaking, and we're going to get to in a little bit, storytelling. That's been honestly the biggest thing I've learned from both of you is that storytelling is important no matter what you decide to do with your life, what your purpose is, what your calling is. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So Diane, I'm going to flip this question on you a little bit. So obviously you knew Carol. I didn't know you started on the same day. So that was a new fact that I learned today. How did she drag you in? Like, obviously you were a client at one point, but how did she really say, oh, and you were just like ready to go, let's do this thing?
Well, she tricked me. No, I mean, kind of, but not.
This is awesome.
There's
no, I kind of did. She's right.
Kind of did. So there's a story here. So she did, but in the nicest possible way. So she was growing Speaking Your Brand, and she, we would chat, and because I was doing consulting, she's doing consulting, and we would chit chat and share resources. And I would, of course, full disclosure, Carol is literally the smartest person that I know. So when I would have a question about politics, history, or business, she's my go-to, right? So I would go to her with these questions, and I'm starting this consulting business, and it's like, what do I do about my email? Or how do I handle this? Or this client said this, and what do I do? I'm not sure, so I had all these questions. And so she, we'd have these conversations. And so she was trying to grow Speaking Your Brand and thinking about adding someone on the team. So she wrote this job description and said, hey, have a look at this for me, would you? Right. So
I was like, is there anything that I left out or like anything that's unclear before I post it somewhere?
So I read this full-on job description. I'm like, no, no, that looks good. This looks good. And oh yeah, that sounds really good. And she's like, yeah, what do you think about it? And I'm like, well, it sounds like kind of a cool job. And she's like, well, how do you feel about that? So now she's like prompting me to she tricked me into just wanting to do that job. And truly, this is how it did come about. And so that's where the idea of me closing my business to work for, because, I said, in all reality, I have 3 jobs. I teach, I was taking on a couple of clients with Speaking Your Brand here and there, but just on a one-off basis. And then also my business. And so then she said, well, what if you, I don't know, close your business? And so that's how it kind of came to be. But it really was, she wrote the job description, I think with me in mind.
She's shaking her head for those of you who can't see this.
I'm like, what is Diane really good at? What does she love to do? What do I need? Where's the Venn diagram of all of that? And I'm going to write the job description as every good marketer should do, right?
Yeah, write it with your quote unquote custom, doing air quotes, customer in mind.
Yep.
Write it with the audience in mind, and then the audience will just be attracted to it. And so then here I came and started working at Speaking Your Brand. And honestly, it has just been wonderful.
And that was 5 years ago.
5 years ago.
Oh, that's right. You recently celebrated your 5-year work anniversary. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, Carol, now I've learned something else about you. So I think this also helps. It's an older documentary, but I just watched the Roosevelt's an Intimate History. It's a Ken Burns documentary. It was released in 2014. So Carol's probably already watched it, but if you haven't, it's amazing.
I think I saw it back when it came out.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm way behind the time, but I was glued to the screen because it's got some really fascinating storytelling in it, which is probably why I really liked it. And then I'm not going to let Diane off the hook because there's one thing that I've learned she's incredibly good at. So if you're a speaker, or even if you're in the corporate world and you're looking to come up with a framework and you need a way to identify the name of the framework, so you need a word that starts with A or R or P, she is your girl. So we get on these calls and she just starts throwing out words and I'm like writing them down like crazy, like, oh, that's a really good one. That's a really good one too.
Diane was the original ChatGPT.
Yeah, she was. That's a good point.
I'm Diane. So
Yeah. Oh gosh, I love that. That's Diane. I've learned that's one of Diane's superpowers.
I am a word girl. Don't ask me to balance a checkbook, but I can come up with words all day long.
Yeah, that's funny. Yeah. So as both of you know, I have a day corporate job. And one of the things I've really noticed in my peers and then some of the folks, on my broader sphere, they struggle with storytelling. And I work with a bunch of engineers, no offense to my engineers out there, but it seems to be a little worse in those who have, those of us who have a technical background. So Carol, why do you think that is? Why do you think people struggle with storytelling?
Because when we all go to conferences, academic conferences when we were in school, or we go to industry conferences when in our careers, the presentations that we're exposed to do not have any storytelling in them. They're very dry, they're very technical, which there's a time and place for that. But also, let's make it fun. Let's make it engaging. And I think we just mimic what we see because we feel like that is the quote unquote best practice, or that's what people do in my field or in my industry. So we feel like that's the safe route to do the same thing that we see. And I believe that we can stand out as speakers and as professionals and as leaders if we do something a little bit different that the audience is going to enjoy, but still respect us for the expertise and the insights that we're bringing to the presentations that we're delivering.
That's so true. So I've sat through presentations. I sit through a lot of gate presentations for a new product, and I'm like, man, that is the driest thing I think I've sat through all week. Diane, what about you? Any thoughts on your side? Why do you think we struggle with storytelling?
Yeah, I 100% agree with what Carol said. And, we do what we know and what we've seen, right? So the examples we've seen are all dry. And so it's, slides with bullet points, and then they read the bullet points and there you go, there's your presentation. And now I've sat through, honestly, probably 500, 600, how many presentations have I sat through like that? So I think the other thing is that storytelling often requires a little bit of vulnerability, right? Because, it's not necessarily that you're always telling your own personal story, but you're telling a story, which requires a little bit of openness, and it's more of a personal touch. And we like, from the branding standpoint, we want to often separate our personal brands from our business brands, but they're not separate. They're all the same brand, right? And so we're trying to keep them separate. So, I don't want to show who I really am or be vulnerable or tell my story or tell anything personal, but those are the ones that really connect with the audience in a deeper way. And it can apply no matter what the industry is and no matter what the topic is. There can be a way to work story in. So if you just think about the most invigorating or engaging talks you've ever attended or seen, even online or even TED Talks, they all have that element in them, right? Where there's some little personal anecdote that's shared, and that's the thing that hooks you in. That's the thing you remember. But I think we're afraid to get vulnerable and not sure we should share personal things in business.
It's so true. I can't remember this statistic. There's a Stanford University study. It's been out there for a long time, but it basically engages more areas of your brain than a logical thought process does. And we get more invested in the talk versus if I just go in with facts, data, and graphs, which is what all of us engineers want to do.
100%.
And stories are much more memorable for your
Mhm.
audience.
Right.
Your audience is not going to remember the 45 minutes of content that you deliver to them. It's just not possible. They're going to remember the stories, and then hopefully that's going to spark curiosity that they're going to want to go learn more or think a little bit differently about the topic that you're presenting.
Yep.
Yeah.
Agreed.
And just think about your best ads that you've ever seen.
Mm.
They don't get up there and list features and benefits, right? Because that's boring. I mean, you can
Yeah.
find that stuff online, but what they do is tell a story and make an
You,
emotional connection.
you made me think. I didn't watch the Super Bowl this year, but I did see the Dunkin' Donuts ad with
Yes.
Jennifer
I saw
Lopez
that
and
one.
Ben
Yes.
Affleck.
Yeah.
I did see it. Actually, it was on just recently, not during the Super Bowl, and I'm like, oh, what? They just grab you with that funny little story. It just really
Mm-hmm.
cracked me up.
Yeah.
Yes. And humor, like even,
Yes.
Oh yeah,
as
humor.
part of storytelling, but even as separate from storytelling, humor in your presentations is really important no matter what your topic is,
Yes.
no matter how serious you think that it is. There is always this place for humor because we need laughing as a form of social bonding. It connects
Mm.
as us as speakers with our audience, it connects the audience with each other. And it also is a form of making the content stick more. So it's actually a
Mm.
learning tool as well. So yes, find a way to incorporate humor wherever you can.
It's funny that you say that. I'm actually not a big Dunkin' Donuts fan, but I'm not sure I'll ever see Dunkin' Donuts the same. Now that I've seen that commercial, it's really funny.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I think Speaking Your Brand does really well is they have their own, you guys have your own storytelling framework. So Carol, I'll start with you, and Diane, feel free to jump in. Can you just tell us a little bit about that framework and what it helps folks do that are trying to become public speakers or share their voice?
Yes, what I noticed over the years working with clients is that, and just with us and just people in general, we're really good at sharing anecdotes, but we're not very good at sharing stories when we're doing so in a professional environment. And the difference is an anecdote is, yeah, like there was a time when I really needed to find a mentor at my job, and it took me a while, but I finally found the person. Okay, well, that's kind of like an anecdote. It doesn't really give me much. Like there's no emotion there. There's no visuals there. I don't really know when this was or what was going on. So instead we want to tell a story. And so the framework that we've come up with, we use an acronym, which we love, as Shannon knows. So it's IDEAL, IDEAL. So the ideal storytelling ingredients, which are imagery. So set the scene. Where were you? In a conference room, on a Zoom call, on a lunch break, outside somewhere. So imagery. D is dialogue. What was the conversation going on? What's that self-talk going on in your head? E is for emotion. Were you happy, sad, frustrated? And what was those emotions that were happening? A is for action. Something needs to happen in the story. So you have to get from the before to the after. And then L is for lesson. So what's that lesson that you're drawing for the audience? Because when you're sharing stories for your audiences, it's an of service to them and the bigger message that you're sharing. You're not just telling a story for the sake of sharing a story. So that is where I feel like that we can get better as speakers is diving into those ingredients. And you've heard us do this just in this podcast interview because we've gotten so good because of the repetition of telling stories and helping clients with their stories. We've gotten so good at it. It's almost like embedded now in our brains. And I'll just say this before we pass it back to Diane, is that we as humans are natural storytellers. Go to lunch with a friend and you're going to tell a story about what happened to you, and you're going to use all those ingredients that I just shared naturally without having to think about it. But we forget how to tell stories when we're standing in front of an audience.
Yes, we do. Diane, thoughts on your side?
Yeah, I completely agree. We forget how to tell stories in front of the audience. And I think that's because we start to focus on the business aspect of the information, right? The list of the features or the list of the 3 things to do. And we forget that it's the story that's going to connect them to that. And so we sort of go towards all the information and then lose the story. But if I like to try to make my talks, I like for my talks to be a story. Like the whole talk is a story. There happens to be some lessons and some information, but the whole thing is a story. And if you think about when you read a book or like some amazing movie that you saw and the experience that you had with it and the journey that you went on. So when I'm working with clients on their talk, I help them see how the entire talk could be that journey, right? So that it's from beginning to end, the framework that we use for the talk is designed to wrap in all those ideal story ingredients to take the audience on a journey, not just receive information. They're having an experience with you. And so just like marketers trying to create an experience through the ads or, their stores or whatever they're doing, you can create an experience for your audience in that same way.
It's funny. I was just sitting here. So the thing you may not know about Carol is she loves musicals and she's addicted to Hamilton. I had to get that in here somewhere. And I think going to oh, go ahead, Carol.
Thank you for the plug for Hamilton.
But I think to your point, Diane, going to a movie or going to a musical, things like that, they are an experience and they really get most of your senses when you go to an event like that.
Yes, yes, yes. And you can use those same techniques, and that same idea when you create a talk.
I don't really think we see it that way. It's funny. So I just mentioned I was coaching a friend as she goes on her first speaking engagement. And naturally, I was so proud of her. She put a story at the beginning, but I think she was going to shortcut it. I was like, no. I understand that you think that they may not care. I was like, but this is how you're going to pull them in to care what you're talking about. I'm like, I actually, the one thing I really learned from both of you is to describe the context of where you are. I think we often skip that part, but I think when you do that, the audience is putting themselves in wherever that situation is with you. They're trying to sit beside you or stand beside you and feel what you were feeling in that moment.
Yes.
Exactly.
All right. So I'm going to get to one of the things that I know is both of your loves, which is the expert trap. And I think for many women, we just want to tell you everything that we know and then forget the rest of it. So what is the difference between an expert and a thought leader? So Diane, I'll start with you and then we'll go back to Carol.
That's a really good question. And I do agree. We try to move towards the expert because I think, again, it's what we know. It's the easiest thing for us to do, right? And so it doesn't really require getting vulnerable. So to me, the difference is the expert is more of the teaching and the thought leader is more of the inspiring, right? And so that's how I kind of see it. But I think that it's almost kind of goes back to that idea of we as women feel like everything has to be perfect, right? And we have to do X, Y, and Z before we can maybe tell the story or get to the other stuff, but we're trying to sort of prove ourselves, right? And so we stay in that expert space because that's how we can show everybody else that we know what we're talking about. But obviously, if you're giving a talk and you're on a stage, I mean, you obviously know what you're talking about. That's why you're there, right? So then moving from that expert, the teacher, where you're just giving the instruction, to the thought leader that you can give them some information, but now you're going to inspire them to take a bigger action, take that next step, do that thing that's going to get them outside their comfort zone or whatever your call to action is. So that's kind of how I see that.
Carol, anything to add to that definition?
Yeah. So, as I always say, we should be experts in the work that we're doing. So the work that you're doing at the company you work for or with the clients, if you own your own business, they want and need our expertise in that. So like Diane and I, we're experts in helping our clients craft their talks and their thought leadership message. And so, yes, we use our expertise there. For thought leadership, as a public speaker or as an author or someone who wants to put themselves out there, is helping your audiences think about something in a different way that they have before. So framing something in a different way. And the reason to do that is because the world, like we know that there's a lot of things that we want to see positive change in the world. And so the only way to do that, though, is to ask questions about why things aren't working well for everyone right now. And what is that vision of how things can be better? And if you stay in what we call the expert trap, you're going to be resistant to ask those questions and to frame things differently because guess what? There are no clear answers for that. And that makes a lot of us very uncomfortable to step into the unknown and to help our audiences step into the unknown. But I believe that's where the positive change is going to happen.
Yeah, it really is scary. Especially when I think, Carol, one thing I've learned from you is trying to connect maybe things that seem disparate on the surface. And when you do that intersection or the Venn diagram, I think you mentioned right before.
Yeah.
people are like, oh, I never thought about those two things connecting.
Yes. And, and here's a prime example. I have this background in tech, but I definitely don't have a background in artificial intelligence. But when ChatGPT came on the scene, I was all over it initially because like my little, tech part of me was very excited about the possibilities. And so I've put myself out there as a speaker and as a thought leader, one could say, on AI, specifically, marketing and brand voice and AI. Now, am I an expert in it in the traditional sense? No, I don't have a degree in artificial intelligence. I don't work at an AI company or an AI startup, but I have enough of a foundation and I have ideas and I want to help other people see the possibilities and make sure that women are in leadership positions because AI is going to affect basically everything, all parts of our society. And frankly, there are not enough women. There's hardly any women. If you see all the names that are constantly talked about and have all the megaphones, there are very, very few women out there.
And we're working to change that.
Yes. Yes,
Right.
we are.
Well, speaking of that, Diane, I'm going to start with you and then go back to Carol. What is a recommendation you would have for a leader that's listening today who's wanting to move in to make a broader impact or become a thought leader in their space?
Yes, that's a great question. One recommendation is, again, as I mentioned before, you don't need permission to use your voice. You don't need permission to speak on a topic. You don't have to wait. You don't even have to wait for somebody to give you the opportunity or the space to do it because you can go host your own speaking event. You can pitch yourself to go speak. You can start your own podcast, but you don't have to wait for permission. Mostly is I feel like, and I know I did this, so I'm speaking from my own experience, is waiting for somebody to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, we'd like to hear from you on blah, blah, blah. Well, you don't have to do that. You don't have to wait. And so look for opportunities where you can have a voice. Well, and it can be big or small. It doesn't matter. Maybe it's just locally. Maybe it's just, maybe someone's listening and they're, they have kids and there's an opportunity at the school where their kids go to school. I don't know what the opportunity is, but you can find these opportunities, but you don't have to wait for somebody to say it's okay for you to do that, right? If you have a passion about something or you have knowledge on something and you want to inspire other people in that area, go do it. And honestly, I would say don't wait for somebody to give you permission. Just go do it.
And I think it's funny is where technology has changed it probably more because I've not followed AI as much, but we all have this little mini computer in our hands called a phone. You can take a video and put it on whatever social platform you feel comfortable with, and have your voice out there. And it takes literally a few minutes. Is it brave? Yes. Is it really scary sometimes? Yes, but you can do it and it doesn't take a tremendous investment on your part to do it.
Absolutely.
All right, Carol, thoughts or recommendations from your side on somebody who wants to have a broader impact?
Along with what Diane said about just getting started, put yourself out there in whatever way it feels like it's the least friction for you. There's going to be some friction, but don't do the hardest thing first. Do something that feels the next easiest thing. And along with that, I always like to think about what conversations do you want to be a part of? So I wanted to be a part of the conversation that was going on around AI. So I stepped into that to be part of that conversation and what could I add? What could I contribute to it? So think about those conversations that are going on in your industry, in your community, in society as a whole, and how can you offer your own perspective on it?
I love that. You just gave me a thought. Well, I'm slipping that one back for when I see you guys in a couple weeks.
Yay.
All right, now we get to have my two fun questions. So I know, Carol, a couple of years ago, you sponsored a challenge about reading books, I believe, that were women. So I'm just curious. I'm going to start with Carol and Diane. I'll go to you. What women's voices are you currently following? So what's on your nightstand or what are you watching right now?
Yes, I have two great book recommendations. I read lots of books. And so I have two that I recently read, both of them by women. So first one is by Fifi Lee. She's an AI researcher. She actually pioneered AI vision. So now that AI tools like ChatGPT, you can upload like an image to it or upload a diagram and it can read it. That is thanks to Fifi Lee and the contributions that she and her team made. She's now a professor at Stanford. Her book that came out a few months ago is called The Worlds I See, Curiosity, Exploration, and Discovery at the Dawn of AI. So it's kind of part memoir, part of this, the AI vision, because she immigrated from China with her parents to the US. So really great story. So that one I highly recommend. The other one is a woman that I saw speak at the TED Women Conference last fall. She's a war reporter. Her name is Jane Ferguson. She's Irish, and her memoir is called No Ordinary Assignment. And she was a war reporter in Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, like the places you can't even imagine going, especially as a young blonde woman going there. And not only just the stories, but talk about vulnerability and storytelling. What makes great memoirs is when the author is willing to go there, and she goes there, and it was an incredible book. Her TED Talk was amazing as well, but I highly recommend the book called No Ordinary Assignment.
I knew you were going to have good recommendations, Carol. All right, Diane, I know you got some too. That's why I slipped this question in there.
I love questions like this. And so I'd like to share a couple of different genres. So books. So I'm going to go less businessy and more history. I think I was inspired to learn about history probably from Carol. And so the first book that I read that was more like a factual history type book is called A Woman of No Importance, The Untold Story of the American Spy Who Helped Win World War II. And it's by Sonia Purnell. This book was riveting. It was so good. And it is the true account of this woman who was an American woman, but she worked actually first for France and as one of the allies, driving an ambulance, and then became involved as a spy working for the resistance. And she had one leg, so she had an artificial wooden leg, and she actually physically ferried downed airmen across the mountains in snow with a wooden leg that was bleeding, but she never got detected by the Germans. So
that's crazy.
It is insane. The story is so good. And I like stories like that because we have in today's world, like different opportunities and things, but we also have struggles, but it helps, I think, to understand the women that kind of helped us get here. Right. And what women did during a time like that. And so, of course, now I've just been completely obsessed with stories of women during World War II. And so another book that I read, loosely related, but some of the stories kind of intertwined, is called Wise Gals, The Spies Who Built the CIA and Changed the Future of Espionage, by Natalia Holt. Incredible. Absolutely incredible. These stories are mind-blowing when you see what role women have played, and in places where you wouldn't necessarily think, oh, well, women played a role in building the CIA. Why would you think that? And then they did. It wouldn't exist without them. And then, if I may, just a couple of other things that are not books, but I am obsessed with comedians, as you might know.
She has her own comedian. She did a stand-up and it's just fantastic. I'll have to find the LinkedIn link and share it in the show notes. It's fabulous. But go ahead, Diane.
Shannon. So I'm completely obsessed with comedians, particularly female comedians, because I've always loved comedy, but I think comedy's been there have been female comedians, but I think it's been the ones getting the most exposure have been men. And so their voices have been everywhere. And there are male comedians that I love, but I think as of late, more women are getting better exposure and better opportunities. And so Eliza Schlesinger, Taylor Tomlinson, who recently took over, I think, what's his name? Stephen Colbert's time slot, Sarah Silverman, Ali Wong. So if you can find any specials by them, and Eliza Schlesinger and Sarah Silverman both have podcasts, excellent. So highly recommend those.
So I think I've just learned two things: that you're an inner spy somewhere. So Carol, you might want to be careful.
Who tells jokes?
Who tells jokes? I mean, this is like, I've heard a lot today in the last few minutes. All right. My final real question is, what is one piece of advice you would give women as they're trying to amplify their voices? Carol, I will start with you and Diane will end with you.
Take the pressure off yourself and amplify other women's voices and lead with that. Like Shannon, you do that with this podcast and the work that you're doing for women in STEM. And then, I think about the work that Diane and I, the gratitude we have for all of the incredible women that we get to work with. And I think back to that war reporter that I just mentioned, Jane Ferguson, and she talked about how in her war reporting, the women herself and other women war reporters, they focused on the human toll of war. because so many of the war stories and war journalism up until relatively recently has focused on the military battles and, what machinery was being used. It's like, no, what's the human consequences of war? And so that's why amplifying women's voices, whether it's women, in towns being affected by war and conflict, or it's women at our workplaces and our industries, is helping to amplify their voices, their stories, and their experiences.
Well, that is so true. That's powerful. I knew it would be.
Mhm.
All right, Diane, what's your piece of advice?
Yes. So my piece of advice, actually, I just heard this today on a podcast. I think it was Elijah Schlesinger's, or it might be another different podcast, and I can't remember who they were referencing that said that, but this person that said this said something to this effect. I'm going to butcher it, but it was, I'm not going to try to be the best. I'm just going to try to tell the truth. And so tell your truth. Like if you just, back to storytelling, if you just share your truth in whatever way that looks like, imagine the impact that will have. Because I just told you about the woman who helped win World War II, right? Like that's incredible. And I'm sure she didn't know that's what she was doing at the time. I'm sure she didn't think she would single-handedly liberate this particular portion of France. I'm sure she didn't know that. But if you just tell your truth, think about who you'll inspire, and then think about the ramifications of the changes that can spur on and the ripple effect that has going forward.
That's really powerful. I knew you guys were going to close me strong. All right. Well, speaking of that, Carol, where can they find you and the Speaking Your Brand community? Where can they connect with you?
Well, if you like listening to podcasts, which I assume you do since you're listening to this, go check out the Speaking Your Brand podcast. Shannon has been on it, and we have hundreds of episodes to help you with your public speaking and thought leadership. SpeakingYourBrand.com. And then LinkedIn is the social network that I hang out on.
Yep. And Diane, how about you?
Only LinkedIn. So you can find me on LinkedIn at Diane Diaz. So that's where I shared my comedy set. So you can find that there. But any other good stuff that Speaking Your Brand is doing or things that we're seeing, that's where we share it.
I'm going to slip one more thing in here, and that Carol and Diane have a speaker archetype quiz. I think I got the name of it right. So that is also on the Speaking Your Brand website. I think it's still up. Is that right, Carol?
Yes, it is. So yes, it's 4 different archetypes, and you can identify which one you are. And Shannon, you're the spellbinding storyteller,
I'm
aren't
the
you?
spellbinding storyteller, which is why this
Nice.
podcast is near and dear to my heart.
Yes.
Yeah. So I will put that link to all that in the show notes. Go take that quiz. I think you'll learn a lot about yourself and the type of speaker that you naturally are, and areas where you might need to work on it. So I think Carol, if I remember right, it tells you it's kind of like your strengths as part of that archetype and some areas you might want to watch.
Correct. I always said, we want to amplify what you're naturally good at, and then just work on adding some extra things just to make you that much more dynamic.
Yep. Well, thank you both. This has been so much fun. And it was great celebrating Galentine's. And when our listeners listen to it, it will be International Women's Day. So thank you both.
Thank you, Shannon.
Thank you, Shannon.